I found her on a Tuesday, just before the first hard frost of the season. She was wedged into the drainage cut behind Maintenance Block C, about 40 meters from the perimeter fence, half buried under a shelf of pine duff and dead leaves that the wind had pushed against the concrete apron. I almost walked past her. I was running the morning check on the heating coils under the animal habitat modules, my mind on a stuck coupling in the fourth run, and a cup of coffee I'd left cooling on the workbench. And what I saw first was just a shape. Something angular and dark, too large to be the rock badgers that sometimes sheltered there, too still to be anything still alive. Crouched down, pulled back the leaves with my glove. She was maybe the length of my forearm, scaled, dark reddish bronze, with faint charcoal banding along her spine, 4 limbs folded tight against a body that was heaving with the labor of every breath. Her wings were tucked so close, I couldn't see the membrane at first, just 2 hard ridges along her shoulder blades. Tail was curled inward. She had a small, narrow muzzle, more elongated than a lizard's but carrying that basic reptilian architecture. Thin nostrils, a faint ridge above each closed eye. Claws, each one no longer than my thumbnail, were dug into the leaf litter like she'd been trying to hold on to the ground when she fell. I stayed crouched for a long time looking at her. I'd been working at Meridian Station for 11 years. I'd handled a lot of xenofauna in that time. The station's mandate was low-intervention cataloging of species encountered by the outer-range survey vessels, which in practice meant we got the overflow that nobody else wanted to manage. Creatures too fragile for university labs, too rare for commercial permits, too strange for the standard containment protocols. Tube-fed a silicate metabolism shell crawler, the size of a dinner plate. I'd assisted in the care of a gas bladder creature that needed a pressurized tank and absolute silence. I'd done overnight watches on animals I had no diagnostic framework for, going on temperature readings and guesswork, and the particular sound of a creature's breathing. Deciding in the dark whether what I was hearing was distress, or just alien biology, doing something I didn't understand yet. I knew how to look at something and ask, is this dying and is that dying fixable? She was dying. Whether it was fixable, I didn't know. I went back to the maintenance shed, got a thermal transport case from the emergency rack, lined it with the mylar blanket I kept there, and went back for her. She didn't react when I picked her up. That told me more than anything else had. Even the sickest animals we'd handled at the station had some response to being lifted, a flinch, a tightening, some residual reflex. She just lay in my hands with the complete passivity of something too far gone to register the change in situation. Scales were dry and slightly rough against my palm. She was cold. Not cold the way a reptile is cold in the morning, adjusting. Cold the way something gets cold when the maintenance systems have failed completely and there's been no heat source for too long. Put her in the case, closed it, carried her inside. I want to be clear about something. What I did in the next 6 weeks was not heroic. It was not strategic. There was no point at which I said to myself, this creature is significant. This creature will matter. I should invest in her survival for reasons beyond the obvious one that she was alive, and appeared to want to remain that way. I'm a groundskeeper and an animal care technician. 4. Civilian contractor. No research credentials. No biological specialization on the publication's record. I run the heating systems. I clean the habitats. I monitor the animals the researchers tell me to monitor, and I call the researchers when something changes that I don't have the authority to interpret. That's the job. What I had in front of me was an animal that was alive, barely, and that was going to be dead by nightfall if nobody did anything. The researchers who would need to make the official decisions about her weren't on site. Dr. Heron and her team were 3 days out from a field rotation, and the 2 junior staff left on station were graduate students who understood theory and panicked in front of anything that didn't match their coursework. Made a decision that I made at least twice a year with other species. I kept her alive until someone more qualified could look at her properly. I would report it fully when they got back. That's all it was. That's all it ever started as. The first 24 hours, I had no idea what she was. I'd never seen anything like her in the station's records, and our records were extensive. Conic anatomy, true-scaled, 4-limbed, with the wing structures and the particular muzzle geometry. had been documented in about a dozen species in the survey logs, but mostly as distant encounters, behavioral observations, no close contact biological data. I was working without a template. I got her temperature up slowly, warm water in a sealed container under the case. Not hot. I'd learned from the shell crawler that aggressive rewarming in a compromised animal frequently kills faster than the cold does. I kept it at 10 degrees above what my thermometer said her body surface was reading, and I bumped it up by 2 degrees every 6 hours. I didn't try to feed her the first day. I didn't know what she ate. I kept her isolated in the back room of the habitat module, away from the other animals, and I watched her breathe. I timed the breaths in the early hours. 17 per minute at intake, shallow and irregular, with a particular catch at the top of each inhale that I logged. And that over the following 16 hours smoothed out incrementally, the catch moving later in the cycle and becoming less pronounced. I am not a veterinarian, and I cannot tell you what that indicated biologically. What I can tell you is that over 40 years of working with animals, you develop a read on the difference between a body that is losing ground and a body that is holding ground. And by the 10th hour, she was holding ground. Barely, but holding. I stayed in the room with her through the night, not because the protocol required it. There was no protocol. I was improvising everything. But because the animals I'd stayed with overnight had, in my experience, done better than the animals I hadn't, and I didn't have enough information to know which variables mattered enough to conserve. On the morning of the second day, she opened her eyes. They were amber with a vertical pupil. She looked at me for about 10 seconds without moving, and in that look, there was something that I couldn't quite classify as animal cognition. But that wasn't what I was used to seeing in the creatures I cared for. Too organized, too evaluating. There was a quality to it that sat somewhere in the space between. This thing can tell the difference between what it is looking at and what it is not. Then she closed her eyes again and went back to whatever the physiological equivalent of sleep was for her. Sat with her for a while. Then I went and did the rest of the morning round. By day 4, she was eating. I offered her a range of protein sources from the station's stores. It was trial and error, mostly error, until I found that she would take small pieces of raw lean meat if I warmed them and held them steady in my fingers, close enough for her to reach without lifting her head. She ate 5 pieces the first time, slept, woke, ate again. Each feeding she was a fraction stronger than the last, and each time I watched her eat I could see the calibration happening in real time. The tentative first bite, then the decision, and then the focused efficiency of an animal that has concluded this source is acceptable and is going to get every calorie out of it that it can. I kept the room temperature at a level that seemed to agree with her. I kept the light low but not dark. I didn't handle her more than necessary, just enough to check the membrane on her wings, which had been dry and cracked when I found her, and to monitor the respiration and the color of her scales, which I was using as a rough proxy for circulation since I had no other diagnostic tools appropriate to her physiology. The color told me more than I'd expected. I started noting it systematically on day 3. The base reddish bronze was deepest along her spine, and at the base of her tail, fading toward a lighter copper along her flanks. When she was cold or stressed, that base color grayed slightly, a quality I can only describe as a loss of depth. The same pigment, but without whatever biological process produced the richness in it. As she improved, the depth came back. By day 6, the gray had retreated to just the wing membranes, which were still compromised. By day 10, the gray was gone entirely, and the reddish bronze had a warmth that I hadn't seen on intake, and that I started to understand was what she was supposed to look like. She watched me when I was in the room, all the time, from whatever position she was resting in. Those amber eyes tracked my movements with a steadiness that I found, if I'm honest, slightly unsettling in the early days. Just thorough. I had the persistent sense that I was being cataloged by something considerably more systematic than I was. Wing membrane was the thing I lost the most sleep over. Dry scales I could address with hydration support. I'd worked out a topical application routine by day 3 that seemed to help, but the membrane tissue on a winged species serves a different function than scale coverage. It has to be elastic enough to fold and extend without tearing. robust enough to sustain flight loads, vascularized in ways that scale tissue isn't. Cracks in hers were not surface damage. They ran into the membrane itself, particularly on the right wing, and in the first week, I couldn't tell whether what I was seeing was damage that would heal, with proper nutrition and hydration, or damage that had gone deep enough to scar. I kept the hydration routine going twice daily. I kept the protein intake as consistent as I could manage given the trial and error nature of what I knew she'd accept, and I watched. On day 8, she moved for the first time. Not much. She shifted from her side to a low prone position, front limbs partially extended, weight resting on her sternum. She held that position for about 3 minutes, then lowered herself back down. In those 3 minutes, her spine had straightened, and her wings had shifted microscopically outward from her body. The first time I'd seen any extension in them, and the expression on her face. If you can use that word about a creature whose facial muscles I couldn't read, seemed to me to register the effort as worthwhile. I told her she'd done well. I do that with the animals, talk to them. It doesn't matter that they don't understand. The cadence helps. She tilted her head at me. Then she lay back down. I should have filed the report sooner. I knew that. Our protocols were explicit about unknown species intake. Full documentation within 48 hours. Quarantine conformation, research lead notification, regardless of field status. I'd filed provisional notes in the system on day 1, flagged as pending follow-up, which was technically correct but practically a fig leaf. What I hadn't done was push the notification up the chain and accept whatever response came back, which might have been transport her to the university xenobiology facility immediately, or might have been photograph and euthanize, unknown draconic species, unknown risk profile, no research warrant, no resources. I told myself I'd file the full report when Dr. Heron was back. I told myself the animal was stable and isolated, and the delay was a matter of days. These things were both true, and they were also a justification. And I knew it. Here is what I didn't know, and what nobody on the station knew. The draconic species she belonged to had been here before, 6 weeks before I found her. According to the incident log I pulled up later, 2 of the survey team's trail cameras had captured something on the eastern ridge. Fast movement, low altitude, shapes that didn't match any cataloged wildlife. The images were blurry, and the automated classification system had flagged them as possible equipment artifact and moved on. Nobody had followed up. What the trail cameras had captured, as I would eventually understand, was a Vethrak scout formation running a survey pass over the Meridian Range. What they'd left behind, in the drainage cut behind Maintenance Block C, was a hatchling they'd decided wasn't worth the transport. I didn't know any of that when Dr. Heron got back. Vera Heron was the kind of researcher who had earned the right to be blunt about things, and used that right consistently. She came through the station door with 3 days of field grime on her, and a data slate full of cataloging entry wantage processed, and she stopped in the doorway of the back room and looked at the hatchling for a long, careful moment. "Paul," she said. "I know. How long?" 9 days. She was quiet for another moment. "What's her weight doing?" "Up 14% from initial estimate. Appetite is consistent. Wing membrane is recovering. The cracks have closed on the left side. Side still has some fragility." Vera crossed the room and crouched in front of the case. Hatchling was awake, watching us both. She looked back at the hatchling with the same expressionless concentration she used on everything, which was the kind of concentration that meant she was moving very quickly through a lot of information. "There's a Vethrak entry in the extended survey records," she said finally. "Her range species, draconic class, matriarchal empire structure, no successful close contact to date. High intelligence ratings from behavioral observation. Territorial. The scouts run in female-only formations." She paused. "There are no males in the species." I looked at the hatchling. "Then how?" "They reproduce without male involvement. The science on the mechanism isn't fully documented in the literature I've seen." Vera stood up. "Point is that this is not a minor animal. This is a juvenile member of a documented interstellar-capable intelligent species, and she was left on our perimeter." She said the last sentence in a tone that meant she'd already understood the implications and was waiting to see if I had. "They left her to die," I said. That would be the most straightforward reading. Whether it was abandonment or a deliberate removal of a defective hatchling, which some of the territorial behavior literature suggests the Vethrak practice. I can't say for certain. She was not left here by accident. Vera looked at me. You understand what it means if the formation that left her comes back. I understood. The Vethrak survey entry that Vera pulled up over the next hour was sparse, but enough to sketch an outline. Observed behavior. Coordinated multi-individual flight formations suggesting military or hierarchical structure. Reaction to human survey vessels. Withdrawal with demonstrated awareness of being observed, suggesting high situational intelligence. Weapon systems. Not directly documented, though 2 survey ships had reported finding equipment that had been transformed. Not destroyed. When inadvertently left in Vethrak territory, items turned to a fine crystalline mineral matrix, while otherwise retaining their original shape. The survey researchers who'd written the entry had speculated about the mechanism. The entry was 8 years old and had not been updated. Territorial parameters. The meridian range fell within a mapped area the survey logs had coded as Vethrak adjacent. Not claimed exactly. The coding was ambiguous, but within the buffer zone of documented movement patterns. We had, by my count, a 9-day-old bond with an infant member of a species known for territorial behavior and close formations scouting that had already demonstrated it was willing to leave one of its own to die on our ridge. If they came back and found a living hatchling in a human facility, there was no clear precedent for how they'd respond. Vera filed the full report that evening. She requested advisory consultation from the 2 civilian xenodiplomacy offices that had any Vethrak documentation. Both responded within 12 hours. The consensus was, do not initiate contact, do not approach the ridge, continue normal station operations, and do not draw attention to the facility. Neither office mentioned what to do about the hatchling. We didn't talk about it directly. We both knew that any formal protocol would involve transfer to a containment facility, and the only containment facilities rated for Vethrak-class species were in university centers 300 kilometers away. She'd barely survived the conditions she'd been in when I found her. Transport, at this stage of recovery, in standard Zisophauna shipping containers, in a university environment with no continuity of care, was not a good probability calculation. We didn't say any of this to each other. We just kept doing what we'd been doing. The hatchling was walking by the 3rd week, not well. She was slow, and her gait was unsteady. The wing buds on her shoulders slightly too heavy for the muscle tone she'd rebuilt so far, and she compensated by keeping her tail low as a counterbalance, which gave her a crouching, deliberate movement, like something perpetually about to sit down. She moved. She moved from the case to the food dish, to the corner of the room where the heating element was warmest, and back again in an expanding circuit that I tracked on my morning rounds and used as the primary metric for her recovery progress. She had started, somewhere around day 12, to differentiate between people. There were 7 of us on station. She would accept the presence of Vera, and, with some adjustment period, of the 2 graduate students. The other 4 personnel she treated with a flat, still wariness that wasn't quite hostility, but that communicated very clearly. Do not come closer. One of the grad students, a young man named Denny, who had a habit of moving quickly and loudly through the habitat module, she tracked with something that went beyond wariness. The second time he came through, she had pressed herself into the far corner of the case, and was making a sound I'd never heard from her before. Low, almost subsonic, that I felt more in my chest than heard. I moved him out of the room and told him to knock in the future and wait. He thought this was absurd. The animal was the size of a shoebox, he pointed out. I explained, as plainly as I could, that the size of an animal is not a reliable guide to the consequences of mismanaging its stress response, particularly when the animal is a member of a species we had no close contact behavioral data on. I explained that we were 11 days into a recovery process that was proceeding well, and that a single poorly timed intrusion could set it back in ways we couldn't predict or easily recover from. Explained that knocking and waiting cost him approximately 12 seconds of his day. He knocked and waited after that, though the expression he wore while doing it was the expression of someone who considered the 12 seconds an unreasonable imposition. The hatchling tolerated his presence when he was still and quiet. She never fully relaxed when he was in the room. I could see the difference in the set of her shoulders, a tightness that wasn't there otherwise. But she didn't press into the corner, and she didn't make the subsonic sound. That was progress enough. With me, she had established something that I would not, even now, characterize as trust in the full sense of the word. What she had established with me was a kind of working arrangement based on consistency. I came at the same times, moved at the same pace. I spoke in the same register. When I reached into her space, I gave her time to track my hand, and I never moved faster than she seemed ready for. In return, she stayed accessible to the physical assessments I needed to run, and increasingly, positioned herself where she could watch what I was doing while I worked in the room. By week 4, she was eating on her own from the dish, without needing hand feeding. By week 5, she had claimed a specific corner of the expanded habitat I'd built for her, and would return to it after any disturbance, which is the behavior of an animal that has decided it lives somewhere. By week 6, the right wing membrane had closed completely, and she would occasionally extend both wings to their full span. Still small, no more than 60 centimeters tip to tip, but structurally sound now, the membrane taut and flexible, and hold them there for a few seconds before folding them back. Forning, she first extended her wings fully and held them open. While looking at me, I sat down on the floor of the habitat room and stayed there for a while. The right membrane being sound meant something that I hadn't let myself fully calculate until I had confirmation. That whatever had been defective enough for the scout formation to leave her, it was not the wing. She had been capable of flight all along, if she recovered. Whatever the Vethrak criteria for deficiency were, they were not what I would have applied. I tried not to think too much about that. The thinking led places I didn't have enough information to navigate usefully. I had started to understand, somewhere in the middle of week 3, that I was not going to be able to hand her off cleanly because of any protocol failure on my end. The report was filed, the advisories were in, Vera had the chain of notification fully documented. It was simpler and more complicated than that. She was going to need whoever had managed her recovery to stay in the picture for her continued care. And whoever that was me. I'd accumulated 6 weeks of behavioral baseline on a species with no close contact baseline in the literature. The only thing standing between what I knew about her and a facility that knew nothing about her was me transferring that knowledge somehow, which meant either writing up documentation comprehensive enough to substitute for 6 weeks of observation, which nobody writes, or staying involved. I was aware that this was how caregiving traps you. I had watched it happen to other technicians over the years. The slow drift from professional engagement to something more personal that changes the shape of the obligation. I was aware of it. I didn't know what to do with that awareness, except to keep it visible to myself, and continue doing the job. The incident on the Eastern Ridge happened in week 7. 2 of the field monitoring team had been running overnight camera checks in the upper sector, a routine task they'd done dozens of times. They came back in the early morning moving fast and quiet, and the senior one, a man named Gareth who had been on station for 4 years and had the specific controlled calm of someone managing a stress reaction, very deliberately, told me to get Vera before he said anything else. The cameras on ridge markers 11 through 14 had captured a formation pass. 7 individuals, low altitude, structured movement, a scout wing operating an assessment pattern. They'd come in from the northwest, swept the ridge in a tight arc, and exited northeast. The pass took 11 minutes. In that time they had, according to the camera timestamps, stopped twice. Once at the coordinates where I'd found the hatchling. Once at the outer perimeter fence of the station. Gareth had not been petrified, neither had the other field technician. They were inside the monitoring shelter when the pass happened, and the Vethrak formation had apparently not engaged with the shelter itself. But on the trail back down, they'd found 3 of the motion sensors in the upper approach path, crystallized, turned to a fine mineral matrix, still retaining the shape of the original devices the way a casting retains the shape of whatever was poured around it. Destroyed, transformed, and left in place. The crystallization was precise. Not the spray of a weapon fired in haste or aimed at a distance. Each sensor had been addressed individually, at close range, with what appeared to be deliberate accuracy. The housings were intact. The internal components were locked in the same mineral matrix as the casings. Whatever the Vethrak carried that produced this effect, it operated at a level of control that suggested it was not simply a weapon but a tool. Something you used with the same care a surveyor uses a measuring instrument. I thought about that for a while after Gareth showed me the camera footage. I thought about the 3 sensors positioned along the approach path, addressed one by one, and then left. Not removed. Left in their new state exactly where they'd been standing. Marking, that was what it was. A marker placed in a medium that doesn't rot and doesn't blow away, and that anything with the senses to read it will read clearly. We were here. We know this place. We know you are here too. Vera called a station meeting that lasted 2 hours. At the end of it, we had a modified protocol. No solo field work above the 400-meter elevation line. All perimeter sensors checked twice daily. The ridge approach cameras set to real-time alert. The xenodiplomacy offices were notified again and again, said, "Do not initiate contact." Nobody said anything about the hatchling in the meeting. She was the only explanation for what the formation had done. Returning to the site of the abandonment, then coming to the station perimeter. And everyone in the room understood this. We talked around it the way you talk around the center of something, when the center is too large and uncertain to address directly. After the meeting, I went back to the maintenance shed and replaced the heating element coupling that had been stuck since Monday. I ran the morning check on the habitat module's ventilation. I did the afternoon feeding round. I recorded the hatchling's weight and noted that the right wing membrane had flexed fully for the first time without visible stiffness at the joint or the primary strut connected to the shoulder plate. I was aware, in a very specific way, that these tasks were not keeping me from thinking. Bam! They were giving me somewhere to put the thinking while I did it. Here is what I knew. The Vethrak formation had stood at the perimeter fence. For a period of time, the cameras clocked at 4 minutes and 17 seconds. They had not attempted to enter. They had not crystallized the fence. They had not crystallized anything except the 3 sensors on the approach path above, which they'd addressed before coming to the fence at all. And addressed going in, not coming out. Which meant they'd known the sensors were there before they walked into their range. That level of environmental awareness before first contact with an unknown installation was not a characteristic of confused or impulsive behavior. They'd known what they were looking for. They'd made deliberate choices about what to approach and what to leave alone. The 4 minutes and 17 seconds at the perimeter fence was not a hesitation. It was a decision in progress. Whatever they'd decided, they'd left. I sat with that for a long time, in the shed and in the habitat room, and in the bunk I came back to well after midnight. The hatchling was asleep in her corner when I checked on her before bed, her breathing slow and regular, tail tucked, the small rise and fall of her sides in the warmth of the heating element. She did not look like an international incident. She looked like an animal that had had a hard 7 weeks and had come through them and was now resting in a place she'd decided was safe. That night I sat in the habitat room for a long time. She was in her corner, watching me with the steady amber patience that I'd learned to read as comfortable rather than guarded. She only went still like that when she was at ease. If she was alert, her posture tightened slightly, a barely perceptible shift in the set of her shoulders and the angle of her muzzle. I tried to think clearly about what was coming. The scouts had come back. They'd confirmed she'd been left at this location. They'd come to the station perimeter. They had not come in, whether that restraint was tactical, whether it was because they detected something inside that changed the calculation, whether it was going to hold. I didn't know. And neither did Vera, and neither did the xenodiplomacy offices, who were dealing with a situation for which their documentation gave no precedent. What I kept coming back to was this. They'd left her to die. They'd made that decision deliberately. Vera's language. And I thought it was the right language. Defective hatchling, a weakness in the line, a resource drain on a scout formation, running a long-range pattern, left on the ridge in freezing temperatures with no shelter and no food source. The expected outcome was a corpse. What they were going to find if they came for her was not a corpse. I didn't know what they would do with that. I had run every scenario I could construct with the information I had, and all of them terminated in the same uncertainty. An interstellar-capable species with territorial behavior patterns and a demonstrated capacity for precision crystallization weapons. Operating with a social logic, I didn't have enough data to model. Xenodiplomacy advisor's best guidance was do not initiate contact, which was sound as far as it went and did not go very far. What I kept returning to, past the scenarios and the uncertainty, was something simpler. I had spent 7 weeks learning one individual's version of this species. I could read her resting posture. I knew the particular quality of her attention when she was processing something novel versus when she was settled. I knew that she tolerated the heating element on her left side better than her right, and that she had a consistent preference for the corner that gave her sightlines to both doors. I knew that she made a specific short sound when she was positioned comfortably, and another when she wanted water, and that these two sounds were different enough that I'd stopped confusing them around week 4. The scouts who had left her did not know any of that. They had made a decision about a hatchling in a particular condition at a particular moment, and that condition and that moment were both gone. I reached into the habitat and held my hand out, palm up, and waited. She looked at my hand for a moment. Then she moved, in her deliberate crouching walk, until she was close enough to settle against my palm. Not quite sitting on it, but pressing her side against it with the particular leaning quality that she'd developed in the last few weeks. The way she'd occasionally let her weight come to rest against my hand or my forearm while I was working near her. Not the desperate seeking of a sick animal, just proximity chosen. I held very still and let her lean. The second formation pass came 5 days later, at 11 in the morning. The alert came through on every screen in the station simultaneously. Ridge cameras, perimeter sensors, all of them triggering within 40 seconds of each other. I was in the habitat module, doing the feeding round. I stayed where I was. They didn't come to the perimeter this time. They came over it. I heard them before I saw them.
It was a sound.
Not loud, not the kind of thing you'd mistake for thunder, but with enough resonance to come through the walls of the module and register as something physical rather than acoustic. 7 individuals dropping altitude in formation, and then the sound of the outer door of the module opening. Vera's voice from the corridor. Everyone stay in position. Don't move. I'm going to the habitat room. She came through the inner door and closed it behind her. We looked at each other. Outside, through the module's ventilation grill, I could hear movement. The particular displacement of air that large wingspans make when they're folded rather than fully extended. The sound of scale on concrete as they landed. Then nothing. Stillness in the way that a predator's stillness is different from any other kind. Not absence but containment. The hatchling had come alert. She was standing, 4 limbs firmly planted, spine straight, wings pulled tight. Her muzzle was oriented toward the outer door. Whatever she could sense through the walls of the module, scent, vibration, some communication channel, I had no access to. She was receiving it and processing it with an intensity I hadn't seen in her since the first days when she'd been too sick to be anything but completely present to the immediate situation. The outer door opened without warning. What came through it was not one of the scouts. What came through it moved differently than the 7 on the perimeter. More slowly, with a deliberate weight that was different from the economical precision of the scout formation. Larger. The doorframe was not designed for something that heightened. It lowered itself through it in a single unhurried motion that managed to convey, without effort, that the limitation of the doorframe was simply not a relevant consideration. I will try to describe her accurately, because accuracy matters here. She was perhaps 3 meters at the shoulder, in the lowered posture she adopted, inside the module. Deep indigo scaling along the neck and back that ran toward black at the extremities. Claws, wingtips, the long ridge that ran from the back of her skull down her spine. The scaling was not uniform. There were larger plates at the shoulder and hip, finer scale work at the joints and the muzzle, the whole surface carrying a surface sheen that I recognized as the same quality I'd seen in the hatchling scales as she recovered. The particular depth of color that indicated healthy circulation, good hydration, an animal in full physiological operation. Eyes were the same amber as the hatchlings, the same vertical pupil, but the iris was ringed with a deep copper that caught the module's lighting and held it. She was not a scout. She was wearing something, I don't have a better word for it, structured bands across the torso and shoulders that were neither armor nor decoration in any simple sense. Worked in a material I didn't recognize, carrying small articulated components at the joints whose function I couldn't determine. It was the kind of thing that exists in the space between ceremonial and functional, carrying the history of a specific role worn into it by long use. She looked at me first, then at Vera. Then she looked down, past us at the hatchling. The hatchling had stopped moving. She was standing in the center of her space with a posture I had seen sent to her before. Not defensive, not frightened, not the coiled wariness I'd seen when Denny moved too fast. She was upright and still in a way that looked, if anything, more like attention than fear. Her wings had partially extended. Her muzzle was up. The large one lowered herself to a position I can only describe as a controlled crouch, her forequarters coming down while her hindquarters stayed braced, bringing her eye level down toward the hatchlings. She held there. A sound came from her then, not the subsonic warning I'd heard from the hatchling in the early weeks. Not anything I had a referent for. It had a structure to it, a pattern of tone and resonance that repeated in variant forms over about 30 seconds, and it operated at a frequency that I was receiving as much through my sternum as through my ears. It was clearly language. I don't mean that metaphorically. The architecture of the sound, the pattern, the call and response structure, when the hatchling produced a quieter, shorter version in response, was communication with an internal grammar. I didn't decode a syllable of it. I could tell it was a question and an answer. The large one was still for a moment after the exchange. Then she turned her attention back to me. I had not moved. I was standing 3 feet from the hatchling's habitat corner, with my hands at my sides, and I stood there and held her gaze, which was the only thing I could think of to do. In that gaze was the same evaluating quality I'd seen in the hatchling's eyes from day 2 onward, but expanded by several orders of magnitude. Not the exploration of an infant learning an environment, but the assessment of something that had been calibrating its environment for a very long time, and was extremely good at it. She looked at my hands, at the habitat setup behind me, at the feeding dish, the heating elements, the organized in simplicity of the space I'd constructed for the hatchling over 7 weeks. She looked at Vera's hands, at Vera's data slate, at the rack of supply containers along the wall with their labels. She was reading the room, the way you read a room, when you want to understand what has been happening in it, not just what is in it. She spent time on the feeding dish, on the heating element placement, on the small bedding area I'd built in the warmest corner, which the hatchling had rearranged over 5 weeks into a configuration that suited her. The substrate pulled toward the heat, the edges built up slightly, the whole thing shaped to the particular way she preferred to lie. It showed use, it showed duration. It showed, if you were reading it carefully, that someone had provided the materials and then consistently allowed the hatchling to decide how to arrange them. She moved her attention to the medical log I'd kept on the wall, a handwritten chart, nothing official, just a running record of weight, feeding volume, membrane condition, behavioral observations. I kept it as a working reference, not a formal document. It covered 7 weeks on a single sheet of paper, with cramped notations in a margin that was running out of space. She could not have read the language, but she could read the density of the record, the span of dates, the fact that it was there at all. She looked at that chart for a long time. Then she turned to the hatchling. The hatchling walked to me. It took her maybe 6 seconds, that deliberate crouching walk, and she came to the position she'd established in recent weeks. Beside my left foot, angled slightly outward, the posture I'd come to read as resting, without being fully at ease, present but not urgent. The way she sat when she was comfortable and watchful at the same time. The large one watched this. Then she did something I was not prepared for. She lowered her head further, the great indigo head coming down until her muzzle was perhaps at the level of my chest, and held that position, motionless. The sound she produced was short, 3 components, and it had a quality in its last component that I found, later, very hard to describe to the xenodiplomacy officers when I was asked to try. The closest I could get was, it sounded like a door that you didn't know was closed being opened. One of the scouts had come through the outer door while I wasn't watching. She stopped at the inner threshold. The large one said something brief. The scout lowered her head in the same way. 4 quarters down, muzzle toward the module floor, a position so precisely mirrored from the large one's that it was clearly formal. Then she withdrew. Vera said very quietly beside me, "Paul," I said, "I see it, that's I know." The large one raised her head. She looked at me for a long moment, and in that look was something I had no framework for, in any of the xenobiology literature I'd read, or in 11 years of working with animals that don't share your species or your cognition framework. It was not gratitude, in the sense I would apply that word to a human expression. It was not simply recognition of a service rendered. It was something more fundamental, an acknowledgement of a state of affairs, a revision of something that had been concluded. A ledger being corrected. She had come back to collect a corpse. She had found something else. She turned and moved back toward the outer door with the same unhurried deliberateness with which she'd entered. At the door she paused and produced a short sound back into the room. In the direction of the hatchling, I thought, though I couldn't be certain. The hatchling made a sound in response. Then she turned and walked back to her corner, and curled, and was still. Outside, I heard the formation lift. Vera and I stood in the habitat room for a while without talking. Through the ventilation grill, the sound of wing beats faded north, then was gone. Somewhere down the corridor, I could hear one of the graduate students saying something in a low, urgent voice, and another one saying something back, and then silence. The module's environmental sensors had been recording since the outer door opened. Every audio feed, every temperature fluctuation, the pressure differential when the outer door moved. The station's passive monitoring had caught all of it. Gareth, who'd been in the monitoring room with 2 of the other staff, told me later that on the thermal imaging, they could see 7 heat signatures arranged in a loose formation outside the module's walls, stationary. For the entire 11 minutes, the large one was inside, not moving. 7 scouts, holding position outside a human research station, on a cold ridge at 4,000 meters of elevation, waiting while their Empress went in alone. I thought about what that meant. The calculation that had been made to send one individual in without the formation, into an enclosed space, with no line of retreat worth the name, among beings whose capabilities and intentions were incompletely known. Sure, it was not recklessness. The behavioral literature on the Vethrak, thin as it was, described a species that did not make reckless decisions. It was assessment. A decision had been made that the situation required direct engagement rather than force. And someone had made that decision and walked through the door. I thought about that for a while. "I need to file an amended report," Vera said finally. "Yes. The xenodiplomacy offices are going to have a great many questions. Yes, you understand that what just happened is going to be in every paper on Vethrak contact protocols for the next 30 years. I looked at the hatchling in her corner. She had her tail curled in close, and her eyes open, watching the ventilation grill with an expression I had learned to read. Over 7 weeks, as neither distress nor alarm, but something quieter. Processing. "She needs another feeding before the afternoon," I said. "The right's neat side wing membrane still needs the daily inspection. And the substrate in her habitat needs refreshing. She's been dragging the nesting material toward the heating element again, and I want to redistribute it before it compacts." Vera looked at me. "That's what you have to say." "That's the job," I said. She left to file the report. I got the feeding supplies from the rack and went back to work. What came in the following weeks was, as Vera had predicted, a great deal of institutional attention. The xenodiplomacy offices sent a 3-person team. The university biology program sent 2 researchers with more equipment than our facility had storage space for. There were clearance reviews, protocols debated and revised, a series of formal communications that went through the advisory chain at a pace suggesting everyone involved was being very careful about every word. There was a week in there that I found difficult in a way that I hadn't expected. and that I didn't talk about with anyone while it was happening. The institutional attention brought institutional assumptions. And the primary assumption, reasonable on its face, impossible to argue with from a biosafety standpoint, was that the hatchling's care should be transitioned to a more qualified team with the appropriate credentials and facilities. I understood the argument. I made the counter-argument once, clearly and without heat. That transition stress in a recovering animal, with no established baseline at the receiving facility, was a documented risk factor, that the behavioral data I'd accumulated was not transferable in any timeline that made the transition sensible, and that the Empress's visit had established a contextual relationship with this specific facility and this specific personnel configuration that had unknown, but potentially significant diplomatic implications. I said my piece. I filed a written version of it. Then I waited for the decision. The xenodiplomacy team lead, a precise woman named Dr. Castillo, who had spent 20 years in first contact advisory roles and wore that history in the specific economy, with which she chose her words, spent 2 full days in the habitat module before she said anything to me. On the 3rd day, she came to find me in the maintenance shed. "The Empress's gesture," she said without preamble. "You understand that we believe it was a formal act within Vethrak social protocol." I said I'd been told as much. The subject-relation-object structure the linguists have identified. Subject is the Empress, object is you, and the relation is a specific term that has no direct translation, but sits in a conceptual category around recognized custodianship. She paused. That recognition in what we understand of Vethrak's social structure is binding. It doesn't transfer. It attaches to an individual. I looked at her. "What I'm telling you," she said, "is that moving her care to a different individual at this point would be diplomatically inadvisable." She said it the way someone says the thing they came to say, and then waits to see how you receive it. "She also needs the wing membrane inspected this afternoon," I said. Dr. Castillo almost smiled. "Yes, I imagine she does." The Vethrak formation made 2 more passes over the ridge. Not scout patterns. Different movement, slower, wider arcs, with the kind of unhurried surveying quality that Vera described as consistency checks rather than threat assessment. They did not cross the perimeter again. The crystallized sensors were not replaced on the ridge. Whatever territorial marking they represented, we left them. The hatchling continued to grow. By the time the university team arrived, she was taking up nearly half the expanded habitat I'd built for her. And her gait had shed most of the early unsteadiness and become something more purposeful, a ground-covering stride that she used on the longer circuits she'd claimed inside the module. Wings she now extended fully and often, a long, slow unfolding that she seemed to do for its own sake, holding the position for half a minute at a time, as if testing the span against some internal specification. The amber eyes had deepened slightly in color as she'd grown, and the charcoal banding on her spine had sharpened into something more defined, the pattern becoming more itself. She had started to vocalize more, in the weeks after the visit, sounds I'd never heard from her before, shorter and more varied in structure than the subsonic warnings and the call and response exchange with the large one. Some of them seemed to be directed at me. I couldn't interpret them, and I told her so, and she would regard me with what I had decided was patience. The same patient amber attention she'd been directing at me since day 2, the same systematic cataloging, but accumulated now over weeks of shared context, so that it had the quality of familiarity rather than assessment. One of the university researchers spent most of her first day in the habitat room attempting to document the hatchling's responses to various stimuli, and at the end of the day she came to find me in the maintenance shed and said, "She watches you differently than she watches anyone else." I said I'd noticed. "It's not a simple imprinting pattern. I've seen imprinting behavior in a dozen species, and this isn't it. It's more like..." She stopped, looking for the right framing. "It's like a professional relationship. She knows exactly what you are to her, what role you occupy, and she's decided it's the right role." I thought about that for a while after she left. I thought about what the xenolinguists on the university team were working through. The recordings from the Empress's visit, which they were treating as an extraordinary primary source. The first documented instance of Vethrak language produced in direct interaction with a human. They had 18 minutes of audio from the Habitat module's environmental sensors. They'd been working on it for 3 weeks by then, and had what they described as a preliminary structural map of the exchange, which put the Empress's final 3-component sound in a category they were tentatively labeling as formal declarative. A statement rather than a question or command, made in a register they associated with official contexts. They couldn't give me a translation. The semantic layer was going to take much longer. What they could tell me was that the sound had a specific internal structure, the 3 components functioning as subject, relation, and object, in a pattern they could identify even without knowing what any of those elements meant. I thought about the door sound, the quality of a conclusion being revised. I thought about the drainage cut behind maintenance block C, about what it means to find something in a condition that has been decided, a verdict already rendered, and to look at the evidence in front of you and decide the verdict was wrong. There was a morning in week 14. By then the university team had set up their equipment. The xenodiplomacy advisors had been through twice, and the station had acquired something close to a permanent state of organized disruption. When I came into the Habitat module early, before anyone else, in the particular quiet of a station that hasn't started its day yet, she was awake. She often was in the early morning, and she'd learned my schedule well enough that she was usually already watching the door when I came in. I sat down on the floor of the module, which I did sometimes in the early morning, because there were no researchers present and no protocol to perform, and it was simply easier. She moved from her corner in that long-strided, purposeful walk and stopped about a foot from me, and stood there with her wings fractionally opened and her muzzle at the level of my shoulder, and regarded me. I regarded her back. She made one of the shorter sounds, the kind that had been directed at me in recent weeks that I couldn't interpret. Told her, as I usually did, that I didn't know what that meant, and she continued looking at me with that accumulated, patient attention. And the morning light came through the module's east-facing panel and caught the deep reddish bronze of her scales and the copper ring in her amber eyes. And the station was quiet around us, I thought. Whatever they decide about the protocols and the diplomatic channels and the research implications, whatever the xenodiplomacy offices work out about what happened when the formation came over the perimeter, and what the Empress's gesture meant, and what obligations it does or doesn't create, none of that is going to change what the last 14 weeks were. She was alive. I had kept her alive, and she had wanted to be kept alive, and she had put in the same long, patient hours of recovery that I had put into the work of her recovery. And whatever came next, that transaction was real, and it was complete, and it couldn't be undone. I reached out my hand, palm up, and waited. She pressed her side against it, the familiar leaning weight, and we stayed like that while the station woke up around us. That's what I remember. That's what I keep coming back to when people ask me to explain what happened at Meridian Station. When they want the story framed in the language of first contact significance and diplomatic precedent, and the historic nature of the Vethrak Empress's acknowledgement of a Grade 4 civilian contractor, not the formation, not the Empress's head coming down, not the sound she made that the xenolinguists spent 18 months analyzing and ultimately characterized as a formal recognition of protective custodianship, a phrase that exists in Vethrak protocol, or a specific act of preservation that carries specific binding implications in their social structure, which no human had survived long enough to observe from the inside before. Just the early morning light on bronze scales and the weight of something that had fought to stay alive, leaning against my hand. The job, 11 years of it. You keep showing up, and you keep doing the work. And sometimes, not often, but sometimes, the work turns out to have been building something you couldn't see from where you were standing. That's all.